Why food sucked in medieval times, vertical bar, boring history for sleep. Good evening, friends. Tonight, forget feasts and royal banquets. We're trudging through medieval muck, where a peasant's gritty porridge clings to the spoon and hunger hums beneath a smoky hearth. Picture a mother kneading sawdust-laced bread, a child craving a forbidden fish, or a lord savoring spiced swan while villagers starve. These raw, haunting tales of scarcity, filth, and resilience will pull you into a world where every bite was a battle. Hungry for more? Like or subscribe if you're hooked, and share where you're listening, what whispers in your night. Dim the lights, tuck in close, the village fire flickers, and history's hunger stirs. Let's begin. Imagine you're a peasant in a medieval village, somewhere in England or France, maybe around the 11th century. Your day starts before dawn, your hands already aching from yesterday's work in the fields. You sit down to breakfast, and there it is, a bowl of barley porridge, maybe a hunk of rye bread so dense it could double as a doorstop. That's your meal. Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow. No burst of flavor, no hint of something new. Why? Because the medieval peasant diet was painfully monotonous. And one of the biggest reasons was the absence of exotic spices. Things like cinnamon, nutmeg, or pepper that could transform a bland dish into something worth savoring. These weren't just missing from your table. They were as out of reach as a castle in the clouds. Spices were the gold of the medieval kitchen, luxury goods reserved for the wealthy. A pound of nutmeg, for example, could cost 7 fattened oxen in the 11th century. 7 oxen! That's a fortune, more than most peasants would see in a lifetime. To put it in perspective, oxen were the backbone of a farmer's work, plowing fields, hauling carts. Trading 7 for a single pound of spice was unthinkable for anyone scraping by. So, while lords and ladies sprinkled their roasts with pepper or stirred saffron into their soups, the common folk were left with meals that tasted like, well, not much at all. This wasn't just about flavor. It was a stark reminder of the social chasm between the haves and have-nots. Every bland bite was a little echo of your place in the world. Now, let's step back and think about where these spices came from. They weren't grown in Europe's muddy fields or plucked from local forests. They traveled thousands of miles along the Silk Road, a network of trade routes stretching from the Far East to the shores of the Mediterranean. Merchants like Giovanni de Marignali, a 14th century adventurer, risked everything to bring these treasures to Europe. Picture Giovanni, his cloak dusted with desert sand, leading a caravan through blistering heat or icy mountain passes. Bandits lurked in the shadows, storms could wipe out months of work, and disease was a constant threat. Yet he pressed on, driven by the promise of wealth. When he reached ports like Venice, those spices, peppercorns, cloves, cinnamon sticks were worth more than their weight in silver. They were status symbols, a way for nobles to flaunt their power at feasts where tables groaned under roast swans and gilded pies. For the peasant, though, the Silk Road might as well have been a fairy tale. You'd never see a nutmeg pod or smell a pinch of saffron. Instead, you turned to what grew nearby, what you could afford. Garlic, mustard, vinegar. These were the workhorses of the medieval pantry, cheap and local. But they couldn't work miracles. Garlic added a sharp bite, mustard a sinus-clearing kick, vinegar a sour tang. They were better than nothing. But against a backdrop of grain-heavy meals, porridge, bread, maybe a thin pottage of peas, they fell flat. Imagine stirring a spoonful of mustard into your barley gruel. It might wake you up, but it's not exactly a feast for the senses. These alternatives were like trying to paint a masterpiece with only 3 colors. They did the job, but the canvas stayed dull. This lack of variety wasn't just a culinary problem. It shaped lives in deeper ways. Diets heavy in grains like barley or rye-filled bellies, but lacked essential nutrients. Malnutrition was common, stunting growth, weakening bones, sapping energy. Children grew up smaller, adults tired faster, and diseases like scurvy crept in when fresh produce was scarce. The monotony also wore on the spirit. Food is more than fuel. It's comfort. It's joy. It's a moment to pause on a hard day. Without variety, those moments felt stolen. Yet peasants endured, finding small pleasures where they could see a neighbor sharing a clove of garlic, a rare apple plucked from a wild tree, a story told over a shared bowl. Their resilience shines through, a quiet strength that carries them through lean times. But why were spices so expensive? Beyond the dangers of the Silk Road, it was a perfect storm of economics and exclusivity. Demand was high. Nobles craved spices not just for taste but for prestige. Supply was limited, controlled by distant producers and middlemen who knew their value. Add in the church's influence, which sometimes taxed trade routes, and the costs piled up. For the wealthy, this was fine. They could afford to dazzle their guests with spiced wine or peppered venison. For the peasant, it meant another door closed, another part of life reserved for someone else. This wasn't just about food, it was about power, about who got to taste the world's wonders and who didn't. Let's linger on that for a moment. Food tells stories about a society, about who matters and who's forgotten. In medieval Europe, the absence of spices in peasant diets wasn't an accident. It was a symptom of a world built on rigid hierarchies. The Lord's feast, fragrant with cinnamon, was a performance of wealth. The peasant's porridge, flavored only with a pinch of salt, was a reminder to stay in your place. Yet, in their own way, peasants fought back not with swords, but with ingenuity. They learned to coax flavor from what they had, to share what little they could, to keep going. That's the heart of this story. Not just what was missing, but what was made possible despite it. Now, as we drift deeper into this medieval world, let's think about another challenge that made food so tough for the common folk. It wasn't just the lack of spices that dulled their meals. It was the struggle to keep food edible at all. Without refrigerators or freezers, fresh produce was a fleeting gift, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Imagine harvesting a basket of apples, knowing most would rot before winter. How did peasants stretch their harvests to survive the long, cold months? That's where we're headed next. Into the world of pickling, drying, and fermenting, clever tricks to outsmart time, but ones that came with their own limits. So, let's keep walking these quiet village paths where the scent of vinegar lingers and the fight for every morsel never stops. The harvest is in, and your family's survival depends on making it last through the bitter months ahead. There's no refrigerator, no freezer, no corner store to run to when the larder runs low. Your world is governed by the seasons and fresh food, fruits, vegetables. Even meat is a fleeting gift. A head of cabbage, a handful of peas, a few apples from a scraggly tree are treasures, but they rot quickly. The challenge of preserving food wasn't just a practical problem. It was a matter of life and death. Without reliable ways to keep food edible, medieval peasants faced constant hunger, especially in winter, when the fields lay dormant and the rivers froze. The issue was that fresh produce was seasonal, and most peasants had no way to store it long term. Spring might bring tender greens like nettles or dandelions, summer a few tart apples or berries, but by autumn, you were racing against time to save what you could before winter's grip tightened. Only the lucky few, those with a small plot of land or a lord's permission, could grow hardy crops like onions, leeks, or cabbages. These were tough vegetables, built to last a little longer, but even they couldn't survive months of cold without spoiling. For most, the diet leaned heavily on grains, barley, rye, wheat, ground into flour for bread or boiled into porridge. These filled bellies, but they were monotonous and lacked the vitamins and minerals found in fresh produce. Peas and beans, dried for storage, added some variety, but they were a far cry from a juicy peach. or a crisp carrot. This grain-heavy diet led to widespread malnutrition, with problems like scurvy or stunted growth creeping into villages like uninvited guests. So, how did peasants fight back against the ticking clock of spoilage? They got creative, relying on methods like pickling, fermentation, and drying techniques born of necessity and passed down through generations. Let's picture a peasant woman, call her Matilda, standing in her dim hut. She's shredding cabbage, layer by layer, packing it into a wooden barrel with salt and water. Over weeks, it ferments into sauerkraut, tangy and sharp, a lifeline for the winter when fresh greens are a memory. Nearby, she's got cucumbers and onions soaking in vinegar, turning them into pickles that'll last months. On a rack by the fire, apple slices and pear halves dry slowly, shrinking into chewy, sweet morsels. These preserved foods were vital, adding a flicker of variety to a diet of porridge and bread. Sauerkraut brought a sour crunch, dried apples a hint of sweetness, pickled herring a salty bite if you live near the sea. But here's the catch. These preserved foods, while clever, weren't the same as fresh. The vibrant colors and crisp textures of summer harvests faded. Pickling made things tart. Drying made them tough. Fermentation gave them a funk that could take some getting used to. They kept you alive, but they didn't delight you. And they couldn't fully bridge the nutritional gap. Sauerkraut might ward off scurvy with its vitamin C, but it wasn't enough to make up for months without fresh fruits or vegetables. The process was also labor-intensive. Matilda spent days, weeks, even preparing her stores, her hands raw from chopping, her back aching from hauling barrels. And there was always the risk of failure, a batch of pickles gone moldy, a sack of dried peas spoiled by damp. One mistake could mean hunger by February. This struggle to preserve food wasn't just a practical challenge. It was woven into the fabric of medieval life. It shaped how people worked, how they planned, how they hoped. Autumn was a race against time, a flurry of salting, smoking, and drying before the first snow fell. Families came together. Neighbors shared tasks. Children learned to thread apples onto strings for drying. It was grueling, but it built community, a shared fight against the lean months. Yet it also deepened the divide between rich and poor. Nobles, with their vast estates and private fish ponds, had access to fresher foods year-round. They could afford to import dried figs or candied ginger, while peasants made do with what they could grow or scavenge. A lord's table might groan with preserved delicacies, but a peasant's was a study in survival. Why was preservation so hard? Beyond the lack of technology, it was about resources. Salt, vital for pickling and curing, was expensive, sometimes costing more than the food it preserved. Vinegar was scarce, barrels were precious, and firewood for drying or smoking wasn't always plentiful. Peasants had to prioritize, deciding which crops to save and which to eat fresh. And the climate didn't help. Damp winters in northern Europe invited mold, while droughts could shrink harvests before they even reached the preservation stage. The church, too, played a role, taxing goods like salt or demanding tithes that cut into a family's stores. Every step was a gamble, every preserved jar, a small act of defiance against hunger. Let's pause and think about what this meant for the soul. Food isn't just sustenance, it's memory, it's comfort. Preserving food was a way to hold on to summer's warmth, to promise your children a taste of apples when the world was gray. But the constant threat of spoilage, the endless work, the fear of running out wore people down. Yet they kept at it, driven by love, by necessity, by a stubborn will to survive. Matilda, stirring her sauerkraut, wasn't just preserving cabbage. She was preserving hope. That's the quiet heroism of this story, the kind no bard ever sang about. As we linger in this medieval hut, the scent of pickling vinegar fading, let's turn our gaze to another piece of the puzzle. Preserving food was a battle, but even when stores lasted, there was something missing from most peasant tables. Meat and fish. These were rare treasures, not everyday fare, and their scarcity made meals even harder to bear. Imagine craving a bite of pork, only to know it's saved for Christmas if you're lucky. How did peasants cope without protein? And what did it mean when a scrap of meat finally appeared? That's where we're headed next. Into a world where a chicken was worth more alive than cooked, and a fish was a dream for most. So, let's keep wandering these village paths, where hunger lingers and the promise of a feast is always just out of reach. Imagine you're a peasant in a medieval village. Somewhere in the 14th century, your days spent tending fields or mending nets. Supper is a familiar bowl of porridge, maybe thickened with peas, and a hunk of rye bread so dense it aches to chew. Your stomach growls, not just for fullness, but for something richer. A bite of pork, a taste of herring, but meat and fish, those are luxuries, as scarce for most peasants as a lord's fine cloak. In the medieval world, protein was a rare guest at the table, reserved for special occasions or moments of luck. This scarcity wasn't just a dietary gap. It shaped lives, health, and the very rhythm of survival, making every morsel of meat or fish a treasure worth risking everything for. The core issue was simple, but brutal meat and fish were hard to come by. Animals like cows, sheep, or pigs were far too valuable to slaughter. A cow gave milk, a sheep gave wool, a pig could fatten on scraps and produce more pigs. They were living wealth, not dinner. Killing one was a last resort, something you might do at a wedding, a religious feast, or when the animal was too old or infirm to serve. Even then, you used every scrap offal, bones, even the blood for sausages. A prosperous family might keep a pig or a few chickens, but most peasants were lucky to have any livestock at all. Meat was so rare that when it appeared, it was a celebration, a moment to savor. Picture a family gathered around a Christmas feast, sharing a single small joint of pork, each bite a fleeting joy. But those days were few, and for months, the table stayed bare of protein. Fish was a little more common, especially if you lived near a river or the sea. Herring, cod, and eel were staples for coastal folk, but they were often preserved dried, smoked, or packed in salt to last through lean times. Fresh fish was a treat, its delicate flavor lost to the salty, tough texture of preservation. Inland fish was even rarer, unless you could catch a small perch in a stream. Freshwater species like carp or pike were prized, but they were often reserved for the nobility, who kept private fish ponds on their estates. For a peasant to fish in a lord's waters was to risk severe punishment, fines, flogging, or worse. The poaching game in royal forests was even riskier. Rabbits, deer, or wild boar were noble privileges, and a peasant caught with a snare could lose a hand or face execution. Hunger pushed some to take the chance, but the stakes were high. This scarcity had deep consequences. Meat and fish provided protein, iron, and fats, nutrients scarce in a grain-heavy diet. Without them, peasants faced malnutrition, weakened immune systems, and fatigue, making their grueling labor even harder. Children grew slower, adults fell ill more often, and life expectancy suffered. The lack of protein also shaped social dynamics. Meat was a status symbol, a mark of wealth. A lord's feast, like King Richard II's 1387 banquet with 2,000 chickens and 500 stags, was a display of power, while a peasant's rare slice of bacon was a quiet triumph. This divide fueled resentment, a simmering tension that sometimes erupted, as in the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, sparked partly by post-Black Death labor shortages that briefly gave peasants access to more meat before nobles clamped down. Let's linger on that historical moment. The Black Death, which killed up to half of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, shook the medieval world. With fewer workers, surviving peasants gained bargaining power. Wages rose, and some could afford to keep livestock for their own tables, not just the lords. For a fleeting decade or two, meat appeared more often, maybe a chicken stew on a Sunday, or a pork knuckle at harvest. But this golden age was short-lived. Alarmed nobles passed laws to freeze wages and restrict peasant rights, crushing hopes of lasting change. The 1381 revolt, though brutally suppressed, showed how deeply food mattered not just for survival, but for dignity. A bite of meat wasn't just food, it was a claim to a better life. Why was protein so scarce? Economics played a big role. Livestock required land, feed, and care resources most peasants lacked. Lords controlled vast pastures and forests, hoarding game and grazing rights. Fish, while abundant in seas, needed boats, nets, or access to rivers, often restricted by feudal laws. Preservation added another hurdle. Salting fish or curing meat demanded expensive salt, and smoking required firewood, both scarce for the poor. The church complicated things too, with fasting days banning meat, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Lent's 40 days forcing reliance on fish, which wasn't always available. These barriers piled up, making protein a distant dream for most. But peasants weren't passive. They adapted, stretching what little they had. A single chicken leg might feed a family, mixed into a pottage to flavor the broth. Bones were boiled for soup, and offal turned into pies. Coastal folk learned to smoke herring over driftwood fires. Inland villagers traded for dried cod. They foraged, snaring small birds or gathering mussels when tides allowed. These acts of ingenuity were small rebellions against scarcity, proof of a stubborn will to survive. Women, especially, were the unsung heroes, coaxing nourishment from scraps, their knowledge of preservation and cooking passed down like heirlooms. This rarity of meat and fish wasn't just about hunger, it was about longing. Food carries meaning, comfort, celebration, connection. A scrap of pork at Easter was a taste of hope, a moment to feel human in a world of toil. The absence of protein made those moments precious, but it also ground down the spirit. Yet, peasants endured, sharing what they could, finding joy in a shared fish stew or a stolen rabbit. That's the heart of this story. Not just what was missing, but what was fought for, bite by bite. As we sit by this peasant's fire, the pot of porridge cooling, let's turn to another shadow over the medieval table. Even when food was available, grains, vegetables, or that rare bit of fish, it wasn't always what it seemed. Dishonest bakers and brewers, driven by desperation, stretched their wares with fillers like sawdust or water, turning staples into risks. Imagine biting into bread, expecting nourishment, only to taste grit. How did peasants navigate a world where even their daily loaf could betray them? That's where we're headed next. Into the murky waters of adulterated food and drink, where survival meant trusting the untrustworthy. So, let's keep walking these village lanes, where every meal is a gamble and resilience shines through the cracks. Imagine you're a peasant in a 13th century English town, your hands rough from a day's work in the fields. You've saved a few pennies for a loaf of bread and a mug of ale, hoping they'll ease the ache in your belly. You hand over your coin to the baker or alewife, trusting their wares will nourish you. But the bread crumbles into grit, tasting more like dirt than grain. The ale is watery, sour, barely quenching your thirst. This wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. In the medieval world, food and drink were often adulterated, stretched with fillers or diluted to save costs, turning daily staples into a quiet betrayal. For peasants, already living on the edge, this wasn't just a bad meal, it was a threat to survival. The problem was rooted in desperation. Bakers and brewers, pressed by scarce resources and rising costs, tampered with their goods to make ends meet. Bread, the heart of every meal, was a common target. Flour was expensive, and when harvests failed or prices soared, bakers couldn't afford enough to keep their ovens fired. They turned to fillers, ground acorns, chalk, sawdust, to bulk up their dough, picture a baker named Alric, his shop lit by a single candle, his flour sack nearly empty as winter nears. He's got a wife and 2 children to feed, and the market's demanding bread. So he mixes in sawdust, his heart heavy but his choices few. The loaf he sells is dense, gritty, barely edible. For the peasant who buys it, expecting warmth and sustenance, it's a bitter letdown, another hurdle in a life full of them. Ale, the go-to drink when clean water was scarce, wasn't spared. Rivers and wells were often fouled by human and animal waste, making ale's fermentation a safer bet against disease. But alewives, struggling to stretch their grain, watered down their brews. Imagine Elizabeth, a widow stirring a cauldron in her cramped tavern, her 3 children watching with hungry eyes. Grain prices have spiked, and the Lord's taxes cut deep. She adds a bucket of cloudy water to her ale, doubling the mugs she can sell. The result is a thin, sour swill that leaves drinkers cheated. Elizabeth knows her customers' laborers. Smiths rely on her ale to soften the edges of their long days. But with every coin tied to survival, she feels trapped. For the peasant, that weak ale isn't just a bad drink. It's a stolen moment of relief, paid for with hard-earned coins. Why was adulteration so widespread? Scarcity and economics were the driving forces. Grain, the foundation of bread and ale, was at the mercy of the seasons. A single drought, flood, or blight could slash harvests, sending prices through the roof. Bakers and alewives faced a brutal choice: raise prices and lose customers, or cut corners to keep selling. Most chose the latter, not out of malice, but necessity. Alric isn't scheming to fool his neighbors. He's trying to keep his family from starving. Elizabeth isn't a crook. She's a mother doing what she must. But their choices hurt those who could least afford it. Clean water scarcity made things worse. With rivers and wells tainted, ale was a lifeline, but watering it down weakened its protective alcohol, sometimes letting bacteria slip through. This turned a safe drink into a potential risk, piling danger onto disappointment. The lack of strong regulation fueled the problem. The 13th century, a size of bread and ale, an English law, set rules for weight, price, and quality. Bakers caught using sawdust or alewives with watery brews could face fines, public shaming, or time in the pillory. In London, a dishonest baker might be paraded through the streets. His bad loaves hung around his neck like a mark of disgrace. But enforcement was weak. Towns were busy, officials were few, and a well-placed bribe could turn a blind eye. Fines became just another expense for producers who saw adulteration as a survival tactic. The church, often taxing grain or salt, added pressure, squeezing bakers and brewers into corners where honesty was a luxury they couldn't afford. The consequences hit peasants hardest. Adulterated bread, packed with sawdust or chalk, could cause stomach cramps, worsen malnutrition, or even kill if toxic fillers like ground bones or plants slipped in. Weak ale offered little nourishment, its empty calories sapping strength in bodies already strained by grain-heavy diets. These betrayals deepened health problems, and malnutrition left peasants vulnerable to diseases like dysentery, which thrived in their harsh world. The emotional toll was just as heavy. Bread and ale were more than food. They were moments of comfort, a shared loaf with family, a mug raised with friends. When they turned to grit or water, it stole those moments, eroding trust. Peasants grew wary, checking bread's weight or ale's clarity, but suspicion strained community ties. Every market trip became a gamble, every bite a question mark. Yet peasants weren't helpless. They adapted, learning to spot bad wares by texture or smell. They shared warnings about dishonest vendors, building a quiet network of survival. Some baked at home, grinding their own grain when they could, though this risked fines from lords who controlled mills. Others brewed small batches of ale, defying restrictions to ensure a decent drink. Women, especially, were key, their knowledge of baking and brewing a lifeline for their households. The story of Agnes, an alewife whose watered-down brew ruined her trade, shows the human cost. She wasn't a villain, just a woman caught in a brutal system, her downfall a mirror of the peasant's own struggles. Her customers, angry at her weak ale, were no different, hungry, desperate, trapped by the same scarcity. Adulteration wasn't just a food issue, it was a window into medieval society's harsh realities. Lords, with private bakeries and cellars stocked with wine, rarely faced tainted goods. Peasants, though, lived at the mercy of a market where survival trumped ethics. The assize's feeble enforcement showed how little power the poor had, their complaints drowned out by the clink of coins. Yet peasants fought back in small ways, bartering for honest bread, sharing tips, holding on to hope for a better loaf. These acts of resilience, quiet and uncelebrated, kept villages alive. Alric and Elizabeth's stories aren't about deceit, but about people navigating a world where every choice was a compromise, where survival meant bending rules to feed those you loved. This challenge reveals a medieval world where trust was fragile, where even the humblest meal could betray. It shows the weight of scarcity, the sting of broken bonds, the stubborn will to endure. Bakers and alewives weren't enemies but neighbors, their struggles echoing those of the peasants they served. The market, noisy with haggling, was a stage for survival, where every loaf and mug carried the hopes and fears of a community. Peasants, cheated, yet unbroken, kept going, their resilience, a quiet thread in the medieval tapestry. Now, as we stand in this fading market, the baker's stall quiet and the alewife's mugs empty, let's turn to another danger lurking in the medieval world. Adulterated food and drink were a hidden betrayal, but they weren't the only threat. The very places peasants lived in their homes, their streets were steeped in filth, making every meal a brush with disease. Picture cooking pottage in a hut shared with livestock, or drinking from a river thick with waste. How did unsanitary conditions turn eating into a perilous act, even for kings? That's where we're headed next. Into a world where dirt was inescapable, and survival meant braving the unseen. So, let's keep wandering these medieval paths, where every bite is a risk, and hope flickers in the dark. Imagine you're a peasant in a medieval village, huddled in your thatched cottage as the winter wind howls outside. The fire casts a weak glow, and you're stirring a pot of pottage over it, the steam mingling with the smell of damp straw and livestock. In the corner, a pig snuffles through the rushes on the dirt floor, its grunts a constant hum. You ladle the pottage into a bowl, hoping it'll warm your family, but you can't shake the worry that the water you used gone bad. Is the barley clean? In the medieval world, unsanitary conditions turned every meal into a gamble, with filth seeping into food and drink from the homes and streets where they were prepared. For peasants, already battling hunger, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a deadly threat that made survival even harder. The core problem was stark hygiene, was almost non-existent. Without knowledge of germs or modern sanitation, medieval life was steeped in dirt. In peasant homes, families often shared their cramped spaces with animals, pigs, chickens, even cows kept indoors for warmth and safety during cold months. Picture a cottage, its walls of wattle and daub barely keeping out the chill. The floor is earth, covered with rushes that soak up spills, dung, and mud. A chicken pecks at crumbs near the hearth, while fleas hop from the pig to the straw bed where the family sleeps. This wasn't sloppiness, it was necessity. Animals were too valuable to leave outside, but their waste created a breeding ground for disease. Flies buzzed over food, rats scurried through grain sacks, and lice thrived in the close quarters, spreading illness with every bite or sip. In cities, the situation was even worse. Narrow streets were choked with garbage-rotting food, animal carcasses, human waste dumped from windows or left to fester. Rivers like the Thames in London served as both water source and sewer, carrying a stew of filth that tainted wells and streams. Picture a market stall selling meat, flies swarming over the cuts as vendors swat them away, rodents dart underfoot, drawn by scraps, their fleas carrying unseen dangers. The air was thick with the stench of decay, a constant reminder of the squalor. Without sewage systems or clean water, contamination was unavoidable. Food prepared in these conditions, bread baked in a smoky hut, pottage boiled with river water, was a vector for disease, turning meals into risks. The consequences were devastating. Foodborne illnesses like dysentery were rampant, spread through tainted water or spoiled food. Picture a peasant family, already weakened by a grain-heavy diet, struck by cramps and fever after a bad batch of pottage. Without antibiotics or medical knowledge, even minor infections could kill. Typhoid and cholera also thrived in the filth, claiming lives young and old. The Black Death, which killed a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, was worsened by these conditions. Fleas, carried by rats that flourished in garbage-strewn streets, spread the plague with terrifying speed. In cities like London or Paris, the crowded, filthy tenements were perfect breeding grounds, turning markets and homes into death traps. Even nobles weren't immune. The story of King John of England, dead in 1216 after eating spoiled peaches, shows how no one escaped the peril. Likely struck by dysentery, his lavish meal became his undoing, a grim reminder that wealth couldn't shield you from contamination. Why were conditions so dire? Ignorance played a big role. The miasma theory held that bad air caused disease, so people focused on masking smells rather than cleaning. Burning herbs or scattering rushes didn't stop germs. Resources were another barrier. Soap was a luxury, clean water scarce, and waste disposal non-existent in most places. Peasants couldn't afford to rebuild homes for better hygiene or haul water from distant springs. Lords and cities had some advantages: castles with privies, monasteries with wells. But even these were crude by modern standards. The church, while preaching charity, often taxed essentials like salt, leaving less for sanitation efforts. Population growth in cities outpaced infrastructure, piling filth higher as more people crowded in. The impact on daily life was profound. Eating wasn't just about hunger. It was a dance with danger. Every spoonful of pottage, every sip from a shared cup, carried risk. Malnutrition, common from sparse diets, made peasants easy prey for disease, their bodies too weak to fight infections. Children died young, adults withered under fevers, and entire villages could be decimated by a bad harvest or tainted well. The emotional toll was heavy. Food was meant to comfort, to bind families, but the fear of sickness poisoned those moments. Trust frayed, could you rely on the market's meat, the tavern's ale? Yet peasants adapted, boiling water when they could, scrubbing pots with ash, sharing knowledge about safe springs. Women, tasked with cooking, were vital, their care a shield against the filth they couldn't escape. This unsanitary world shaped medieval society in deeper ways. Disease didn't discriminate, but the poor suffered most. Lords, with better food and cleaner halls, had some protection, though not enough to save King John. Peasants, living amid dung and rats, bore the brunt. The Black Death's toll up to half of Europe's people sparked change, as labor shortages gave survivors leverage, but it came at a horrific cost. The church, offering prayers but little practical help, reinforced a fatalistic view that disease was God's will, not man's failure. Yet glimmers of resilience shone through. Monasteries, with stricter hygiene for monks, sometimes shared clean water or bread with the poor. Villagers banded together, digging new wells or clearing streams, small acts of defiance against the dirt. The story of unsanitary conditions isn't just about filth. It's about survival in a world where danger lurks in every bite. Picture a mother, straining pottage through a cloth, hoping to keep her children safe. Or a market vendor, swatting flies from his stall, trying to earn an honest coin. These weren't careless people but fighters, navigating a world rigged against them. The Black Death's shadow loomed large, but so did human tenacity, boiling, scrubbing, praying, enduring. The market, noisy with haggling, was a battleground, where every loaf or fish carried risk and hope. Peasants, battered by disease yet unbroken, kept going, their resilience a quiet thread in the medieval weave. This challenge shows a society where survival demanded constant vigilance. Lords dined in grand halls, but even their feasts could sicken. Peasants, cooking amid livestock, faced greater odds, their meals a roll of the dice. The church's charity bread from monasteries, alms for the sick, was a flicker of light, but it couldn't clean the streets or purify the rivers. King John's death, dramatic yet common, underscores the era's fragility, where a peach could fell a king as easily as a peasant. Yet people adapted, sharing clean water, learning which foods spoiled fastest, holding fast to the community. These small acts, unrecorded but vital, kept villages alive through plague and pestilence. As we linger in this smoky cottage, the pottage pot cooling and the pig's snuffles fading, let's turn to another force shaping the medieval table. Unsanitary conditions made eating a gamble, but the church added its own burdens, dictating what could be eaten and when. Imagine facing Lent's 40-day fast, giving up meat and dairy when your diet's already bare. How did religious rules deepen hunger for the poor, and what solace did they offer? That's where we're headed next, into a world where faith was both trial and comfort, and every meal carried the weight of divine law. So, let's keep wandering these medieval paths, where hunger meets hope and resilience burns bright. Picture yourself as a peasant in a 14th century village, gathered with your family around a rough-hewn table in the dim glow of a single candle. The meal is a meager, thin pottage of barley and turnips, a crust of hard bread. It's Lent, and the Catholic Church's rules weigh heavily: no meat, no dairy, no eggs for 40 days. Your stomach aches, your children's faces are gaunt, but you bow your heads in prayer, thanking God for what little you have. In the medieval world, the church wasn't just a spiritual guide. It shaped every bite you took, imposing fasting and abstinence that deepened hunger for the poor. These rules, meant to purify the soul, often pushed peasants to the brink, making food not just scarce, but a test of faith. Yet, in its shadow, the church offered glimmers of charity, a complex force of burden and solace. The central issue was the church's iron grip on daily life, especially food. The Catholic calendar was dotted with fasting days, Lent's 40 days before Easter, Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and other holy seasons when meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden. For peasants, already subsisting on grain-heavy diets, these restrictions were brutal. Imagine John and Margaret, a peasant couple with 3 children, scraping by on a small plot of land. Their usual fare is pottage and bread, with a rare scrap of salted pork or dried fish for flavor. When Lent arrives, they put away their tiny meat stores, left with only broth and roots. The children, too young to grasp the spiritual purpose, cry from hunger, their small bodies weakening. John, devout but weary, struggles to keep faith, while Margaret dreams of the stew she'll make when Easter comes. This wasn't just a dietary shift. It was a physical and emotional trial, piling hardship onto lives already stretched thin. The church's rules didn't stop at Lent. Weekly lean days, Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays banned meat year-round, pushing peasants to rely on fish or vegetables. Fish was a luxury most couldn't afford, especially inland, where rivers were often Lord-controlled. Vegetables like turnips or leeks were scarce in winter, leaving bread and gruel as the only options. For the wealthy, fasting was a minor inconvenience. They could import nuts, fruits, or stock fish ponds with carp. But for peasants, it meant hunger. The church preached fasting as penance, a way to mirror Christ's suffering. But for those who rarely tasted meat, it felt like punishment. The irony was stark. The poor, least able to spare food, bore the heaviest burden of spiritual discipline. The church's influence went beyond diet to enforcement. Poaching game from royal forests, often a desperate act to feed a starving family, was a sin and a crime, punished harshly with fines, flogging, or death. The church, aligned with secular lords, upheld these bans, viewing defiance as rebellion against God's order. Imagine a peasant, driven by his children's hunger, setting a snare for a rabbit in the Lord's woods. Caught, he faces mutilation or exile, his family left worse off. The church's moral framework, meant to unify society, reinforced a hierarchy where the poor suffered most. Its teachings on charity clashed with its role in maintaining feudal control, leaving peasants caught between divine law and survival. Yet the church was not wholly unyielding. Monasteries and abbeys, with vast lands and well-stocked larders, often provided food aid. Monks distributed bread, ale, or pottage to the needy, especially on holy days. Picture an abbey gate, where gaunt villagers line up for a loaf from the monks' ovens. This charity was a lifeline, a rare moment of relief in a world of want. Some monasteries ran hospitals or almshouses, feeding the sick and destitute. The story of an abbess named Hildegard, moved by the hollow faces at her gate, ordering her kitchens to make barley pottage for all, shows this compassion. Her act, though small, lifted spirits, giving villagers strength to face another day. But charity had limits. During famines, when crops failed and hunger swept the land, monasteries couldn't meet the need. Their aid, tied to church doctrine, often came with expectations of gratitude, obedience, acceptance of one's lot. The consequences of the church's rules were harsh. Fasting deepened malnutrition, already rampant from grain-heavy diets. Without meat or dairy, peasants lacked protein and fats, weakening bodies and making diseases like dysentery deadlier. Children grew stunted, adults tired faster, and childbirth became riskier. Emotionally, fasting tested resilience. Food was a rare comfort, a moment to share with family. When Lent stripped even that away, it sapped hope. Yet faith was a double-edged sword. It demanded sacrifice but offered solace. Peasants prayed through hunger, believing their suffering earned heavenly reward. The church's promise of salvation kept them kneeling, even as their stomachs growled. Why was the church's influence so pervasive? Its power was unmatched, shaping laws, culture, and minds. Priests preached fasting as God's will, and fear of damnation drove compliance. The church owned vast lands, controlling grain and game, and its tithes, 10% of a peasant's produce cut into already meager stores. Secular lords, backed by the church, enforced fasting rules, tying spiritual and earthly obedience together. Yet the church wasn't monolithic. Monasteries innovated agriculture, improving crop yields, and preserved ancient knowledge on food storage. Their charity, though paternalistic, saved lives. This tension between burden and relief defined the church's role, a force that both oppressed and uplifted. Peasants didn't just endure, they adapted. Some skirted fasting rules, eating forbidden meat in secret, though this risked social ostracism or worse. Others leaned on community, sharing monastery alms or pooling vegetables for pottage. Women, tasked with feeding families, were vital, stretching broth or hiding scraps from tithe collectors. The story of John and Margaret, gaunt but praying through Lent, shows this resilience. They honored the fast, their faith a shield against despair. But Margaret's quiet planning for Easter's meal, a fish perhaps, or a bit of bacon kept hope alive. These small acts, unrecorded but countless, wove the fabric of survival. The church's influence reveals a medieval world where food was a spiritual battlefield. Fasting rules, meant to purify, deepened hunger, reinforcing a hierarchy where the poor bore the cost of piety. Lords feasted on fish during Lent, while peasants starved. Poaching's harsh penalties showed the church's complicity in feudal control, yet its charity bred from monks, soup from abbeys offered flickers of light. John and Margaret's story isn't unique but universal, a glimpse of millions who balanced faith and hunger. The village church, its bells tolling, was both taskmaster and refuge, its shadow long but not unbroken. Peasants, battered by rules yet sustained by belief, kept going, their prayers a quiet defiance of hardship. This challenge shows a society where every meal was a test, not just of body, but of soul. Lords, with stocked fish ponds, sidestepped fasting's bite. Peasants, with only gruel, faced it head-on, their faith both burden and strength. The church's charity, like Hildegard's pottage, was a rare kindness, but it couldn't erase the hunger Lent brought. The market, where alms were shared, was a stage for survival, where every loaf carried spiritual weight. Peasants, hungry yet hopeful, endured, their resilience a thread in the medieval tapestry. Now, as we linger in this quiet village, the church bells fading and the pottage pot empty, let's turn to a stark contrast. The church's rules made food a trial for peasants, but for nobles, food was a spectacle of wealth. Imagine a lord's hall, lit by candles, tables groaning with roast swan and spiced wine. How did these lavish feasts highlight the chasm between rich and poor, and what dangers hid in their excess? That's where we're headed next, into a world where opulence dazzled but peril lingered, and every banquet told a story of inequality. So, let's keep wandering these medieval paths, where hunger meets splendor and resilience shines through. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a grand castle hall, the air thick with the scent of roasting meat and the flicker of 100 candles casting shadows on tapestries. The tables groan under platters of gilded peacock, spiced wine, and sugar sculptures shaped like unicorns. Laughter and music fill the space as lords and ladies tear into delicacies, their jeweled fingers glistening with grease. This is a medieval feast, a dazzling display of wealth and power, a world apart from the peasant's thin pottage and stale bread. In the Middle Ages, such banquets were rare spectacles, reserved for the nobility, showcasing opulence while highlighting the chasm between rich and poor. Yet even here, amid the splendor, danger lurked: spoiled food, overindulgence, and the resentment of those serving the feast. For the elite, these feasts were a triumph. For the masses, they were a cruel reminder of what they'd never taste. The central issue was the stark contrast between noble excess and peasant scarcity. While peasants toiled for a crust of rye bread, nobles feasted on lavish spreads that flaunted their status. A single banquet, like King Richard II's in 1387, could feature 2,000 chickens, 500 stags, and 1,000 piglets, enough to feed a village for months. These feasts weren't just meals. They were performances, staged to impress allies, intimidate rivals, and cement power. Imagine a lord's great hall, its oak table stretching long, piled with roast boar, venison pies, and delicate blancmange, a creamy dish of chicken, rice, and sugar. Spices like saffron, cinnamon, and cloves, worth more than gold, perfumed the air, their exotic origins a boast of wealth. For nobles, every dish was a statement: we rule, we indulge, we live above the rest. The details of these feasts were staggering. Picture Guillaume, the royal cook, orchestrating a small army in the castle kitchens. Days before the banquet, wagons roll in with Burgundy wine, Alpine cheeses, and crates of spices from the Orient. Huntsmen deliver deer and boar, their carcasses slung over saddles, ready for the spit. In the cavernous kitchen, fires roar, cauldrons bubble with almond soups, and bakers knead dough for manchette's soft white bread reserved for the elite. Guillaume's masterpiece might be a roast swan, its neck curved gracefully, or an aspic studded with fruit, gilded with gold leaf. Subtle sugar sculptures of castles or coats of arms dazzle the eye, edible art that screams privilege. As servants parade these dishes into the hall, nobles gasp and applaud, gorging on flavors peasants could only dream of, washing it down with spiced wine and frothy ale. But even this splendor hid dangers. Without refrigeration, spoilage was a constant threat. A roast pig, golden and crackling, could harbor bacteria, if not cooked perfectly. Sauces, left standing in warm halls, could turn rancid. Food poisoning was common, with nobles falling ill from tainted meat or overindulgence. Imagine a lady, her face flushed with wine, excusing herself as her stomach churns from rich sauces. A knight, his teeth rotting from sugary confections, winces as he bites into tough venison. The sheer volume of food, dozens of courses, hours of eating led to digestive woes, sometimes fatal. Gluttony could kill, as tales of courtiers eating themselves to death attest. Even Guillaume, proud of his creations, knew the risk, his artistry shadowed by the fear of a spoiled dish feeling allured. The social implications were profound. Feasts reinforced the medieval hierarchy, where food was a marker of status. Peasants, subsisting on gruel, could only imagine such bounty. Servants, hovering at the hall's edges, watched the excess with a mix of envy and resentment. Picture a serving boy, his own supper, a scrap of coarse bread, clearing plates piled with uneaten delicacies. Tomorrow, he'll return to his hut, the feast a taunting memory of a world beyond his reach. This divide-bred tension, fueling unrest, like the 1381 Peasants Revolt, where hunger and inequality sparked rebellion. Feasts weren't just meals. They were displays of power that rubbed salt in the wounds of the poor. The contrast was starkest in preparation. Nobles had resources, peasants lacked private hunts, stocked cellars, armies of cooks. Spices, ferried by merchants like Giovanni de Marignoli across perilous silk roads, were noble privileges. A pinch of pepper, costing a peasant's yearly wage, was sprinkled freely at banquets. White bread, made from finely milled wheat, was a lord's right, while peasants ate black bread of rye or barley, gritty and tough. The church, which banned meat during Lent, allowed nobles to substitute with fish from private ponds, while peasants starved. This inequality wasn't accidental. It was the backbone of feudal society, where food access mirrored power. Yet danger didn't spare the rich. Spoilage, unchecked by modern food safety, could strike any table. King John's death in 2060, likely from dysentery after eating spoiled peaches, shows how even royalty faced risks. Banquets, meant to showcase strength, could expose weakness. A lord, felled by bad meat, was no less mortal than a peasant. Overindulgence, too, was a peril. Nobles, gorging past satiety, suffered gout, obesity, or worse. The feast's excess, meant to dazzle, could backfire. A reminder that medieval life was precarious for all, though peasants bore the brunt. Resilience, though, flickered even here. Servants, scraping by on leftovers, learned to stretch scraps into meals. Cooks like Guillaume honed their craft, balancing art and safety, their skill a quiet defiance of spoilage's threat. Peasants, excluded from feasts, found joy in their own rare gatherings, Christmas pork shared with neighbors, a fish stew at Easter. These moments, small but vital, echoed the banquet's communal spirit, if not its bounty. Women, tasked with feeding families, were unsung heroes, turning bones into broth or bartering for a taste of meat. Their ingenuity, passed down through generations, kept hope alive, a counterpoint to the Lord's excess. The feast's historical context deepens its meaning. By the late 40th century, Europe's Little Ice Age brought colder weather and crop failures, widening the gap between rich and poor. Nobles with wealth to import luxuries doubled down on conspicuous consumption, their feasts growing more extravagant as peasants starved. The Black Death, killing up to half the population, shifted dynamics briefly. Labor shortages let some peasants eat meat more often, but nobles fought back with laws to restore order. Feasts became battlegrounds of status, where every spiced dish was a claim to dominance. Yet the serving staff's resentment, the cook's gamble with spoilage, the peasant's distant hunger, these wove a complex tapestry of survival and strife. The rare medieval feast wasn't just a meal. It was a mirror of society's divides. Lords feasted to assert power, but their excess carried risks of poisoned sauces, bloated bellies, angry underlings. Servants, watching from the shadows, carried the weight of inequality, their own meals a stark contrast. Peasants, barred from the hall, clung to their own rituals, their resilience a quiet rebellion against exclusion. Guillaume's kitchen, a hive of artistry, was a stage for both triumph and peril, where every dish was a gamble. The market, where spices arrived, was a distant echo, its wealth trickling only to the elite. Peasants, hungry yet enduring, wove their own story, their shared scraps a defiance of the Lord's splendor. This challenge shows a world where food was power, where feasts dazzled but divided. Nobles, with their sugar castles, lived a dream peasants could only glimpse. Servants, clearing plates, bore witness to the gap. The church, blessing banquets, reinforced the hierarchy, its charity a faint counterpoint. King Richard's 1,387 feast, with its thousands of animals, was a spectacle, but its shadow peasant hunger, servant envy, was the era's truth. Yet resilience shone through in cook's skill, servant's grit, peasant's hope. The banquet hall, loud with revelry, was a stage for survival, where every bite told a story of. As we linger in this glowing hall, the feast's embers dying and the laughter fading, let's step back to reflect on the medieval world's culinary story. The noble banquet, a blaze of wealth, stands in stark contrast to the peasant's struggle, where every meal was a fight against scarcity, filth, and faith's demands. How do these challenges, spiceless gruel, spoiled feasts, fasting's bite shape our understanding of resilience and gratitude? That's where we're headed next, into a conclusion that weaves these threads together, urging us to savor our modern bounty while honoring those who endured. So, let's keep wandering these medieval paths, where hunger meets hope and the past whispers lessons for today. As we sit by the fading embers of a medieval hearth, the village quiet under a starlit sky, let's gather the threads of our journey through the culinary world of the Middle Ages. We've walked muddy lanes, stood in smoky markets, and peeked into grand banquet halls, tracing why food was so hard for the common folk. From bland porridge to spoiled feasts, from fasting's bite to filth's shadow, the story of medieval food is one of scarcity, struggle, and stubborn hope. It's a tale of peasants scraping by, nobles gorging on excess, and everyone facing the perils of a world without safety nets. Now, as the night deepens, let's weave these pieces together, reflecting on what they teach us about resilience, inequality, and the simple miracle of a full plate. Imagine a peasant family, sharing a crust of bread, their faces lit by firelight, their laughter soft, but defiant. That's the heart of this story, and it's time to bring it home. Our journey began with the lack of variety in spices, a world where peasants stirred gray gruel without a hint of cinnamon or pepper. Spices, ferried by merchants like Giovanni de Marignoli across the perilous Silk Road, were luxuries for lords, costing more than a peasant's yearly labor. A pound of nutmeg for 7 oxen? Unthinkable. Instead, garlic, mustard, and vinegar were the poor's palate, doing little to lift the monotony of barley and rye. This wasn't just about taste. It was a mark of class, a reminder that flavor was a privilege. Yet peasants endured, coaxing what joy they could from a shared clove of garlic, their resilience a quiet counterpoint to noble opulence. Then we turned to the challenge of preservation, where fresh food was a fleeting gift. Without refrigerators, peasants raced against rot, pickling cabbage into sauerkraut, drying apples or salting fish. Picture Matilda, her hands raw from chopping, packing barrels to outlast winter. These methods of fermentation, drying, smoking, were clever but costly, demanding salt or vinegar most couldn't afford. Preserved foods added variety but lost the vibrancy of fresh harvests, and failures of a moldy batch, a spoiled jar meant hunger. The labor, often women's work, bound communities, but the gap between noble cellars and peasant huts grew wider. Still, the effort to save every scrap was a testament to hope, a fight to hold summer's warmth through the cold. The rarity of meat and fish deepened the struggle. A pig was wealthy, not dinner, slaughtered only for feasts like Christmas. Fish, salted or smoked, was a coastal treat, but inland it was a lord's delicacy. Poaching in royal forests risked death, yet hunger drove some to try. The Black Death briefly shifted this, giving peasants leverage to eat meat more often. But nobles' laws crushed that hope, sparking revolts like 1380s. Protein scarcity weakened bodies, stunted growth, and fueled resentment. Yet peasants stretched scraps, bones for broth, offal for pies, showing ingenuity in the face of want. A shared rabbit stew was more than food. It was defiance. Adulterated food and drink added betrayal to scarcity. Bakers like Alric mixed sawdust or chalk into bread. Alewives like Elizabeth watered down their brews, driven by soaring grain prices and taxes. The assize of bread and ale tried to curb this, but weak enforcement let deceit thrive. Imagine biting into a gritty loaf, expecting nourishment, or sipping weak ale paid for with your last coin. These weren't acts of greed but survival, yet they hurt peasants most, worsening malnutrition and eroding trust. Still, villagers adapted, sharing warnings, baking at home, their resilience, a shield against a market rigged against them. Unsanitary conditions turned every meal into a gamble. Peasants lived with livestock, their huts a mix of dung and straw. Cities like London were worse, streets choked with waste, rivers like the Thames a sewer. Flies swarmed markets, rats carried fleas, and diseases dysentery, typhoid, and the Black Death flourished. King John's death in 1216, likely from spoiled peaches, shows even nobles weren't safe. Without germ theory, people fought filth blindly, boiling water or scrubbing with ash. Women, cooking amid dirt, were vital, their care a fragile defense. The Black Death's toll up to half of Europe underscored the peril, but communal efforts, like digging wells, showed grit in the face of death. The Church's influence, our sixth stop, added spiritual weight to hunger. Lent's 40-day ban on meat, dairy, and eggs, plus weekly fasting days, hit peasants hardest. Picture John and Margaret, their children crying as they eat only gruel, honoring faith over fullness. Poaching, a desperate act, brought harsh penalties, the Church backing feudal lords. Yet monasteries offered charity bread, ale, pottage like Hildegard's Abbey feeding the gaunt. Fasting deepened malnutrition, But faith gave solace, promising heaven for earthly pain. Peasants balanced piety and survival, their prayers a lifeline through hunger's test. Finally, the rare medieval feast lit up the noble world, a stark contrast to peasant want. Picture Guillaume, the royal cook, crafting roast swan and sugar castles, spices like saffron flowing freely. Banquets, like Richard II's with 2,000 chickens, were power plays, dazzling guests while servants, eating coarse bread, seethed. Spoilage and gluttony brought risks. Nobles fell ill. Some died, their excess a mirror of fragility. Servants, clearing uneaten plates, carried resentment, their own hunger, a silent rebuke. Feasts were spectacles, but they underscored inequality. A lord's spiced wine, mocking a peasant's watery ale. What ties these challenges together? Scarcity, inequality, and peril. Peasants faced spiceless monotony, rotting harvests, rare protein, tainted bread, filthy kitchens, fasting's demands, and noble excess, each a hurdle in a life of toil. Yet resilience shines through Matilda's pickling, Elizabeth's brewing, John's prayers, Guillaume's artistry. These weren't heroes of legend, but ordinary people, fighting hunger with cunning and community. Women especially were pillars, stretching scraps, sharing alms, weaving hope into hardship. The church, both oppressor and comforter, shaped this world, its rules a burden, its charity a flicker. Inequality was the era's pulse. Lords feasted, peasants starved, servants watched, but danger didn't spare anyone, from King John's peaches to the Black Death's sweep. Contrast this with today, and the medieval world feels like a distant dream. Walk into a modern supermarket, and it's a marvel, a rainbow of produce, meats from every corner, spices once worth oxen now in jars. A medieval peasant, seeing aisles of Cheetos labeled real cheese, would be stunned, their gritty loaves a faint memory. Clean water flows, refrigeration hums, and food safety laws guard our plates. Yet our abundance has shadowed waste, inequality, and environmental strain. Some still go hungry, their struggles echoing medieval want. The peasant's fight teaches us to savor simplicity, to share what we have, to value the labor behind every bite. What lessons linger? Gratitude first. Every apple, every slice of bread is a triumph of centuries of farmers, cooks, reformers who pushed past scarcity. The medieval peasant, enduring sawdust loaves or fasting's grip, laid stones for our plenty. Their resilience inspires us to face our challenges: food insecurity, climate change with grit and hope. Community, too, is a lesson. Villagers shared alms, warned of bad ale, cooked together. We can do the same, supporting local farmers, fighting for fair access, building tables where all are welcome. Finally, perspective. The peasant's joy in a Christmas pork scrap reminds us to find delight in small things: a warm meal, a shared laugh rather than chasing excess. This story isn't just history, it's a mirror. The medieval world, with its hunger and hope, asks us to cherish our bounty, to honor those who toiled, to build a future where no one faces an empty bowl. Picture that peasant family again. Their fire low, their bread shared, their lives, unrecorded but vital, carried the world forward. As we close this tale, let's raise a quiet toast, not with spiced wine, but with gratitude to their endurance, to our plenty, to the promise of better days. The medieval table, sparse or lavish, was a stage for survival, and its lessons feed us still. As we leave this medieval village, the hearth cold and the stars bright, let's carry these stories forward. The struggles of peasants, the excess of lords, the resilience of all they remind us to savor each bite, to share our table, to honor the past. If this journey's eased you into calm, Maybe note where you're reading under a quiet sky, in a cozy nook. It's a small joy, knowing we're bound by these tales. Until next time, rest well, dream deep, and let the medieval world fade into the night.